is going on, right? So like there was this idea, there was definitely a feeling of like we missed the whole thing.
Exactly. It's a strange feeling, all your cultural life, to feel that you came in a little too late, that all the action was just behind you.
Right.
And you know, I had older cousins growing up, and they always seemed to be really plugged into, you know, what was really going on that I wasn't old enough to see or wasn't old enough to do, and that just endlessly, of course, made me want to see it even more.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in New York City.
Oh, so you're like a New York kid?
I am a New York kid, yeah.
That's amazing. How did that happen? What were your parents doing?
My dad was a lawyer, and he was a native New Yorker. He grew up in the city. And my mother was, she grew up in upstate New York in Syracuse.
Okay.
And came to the city to work as a doctor at St. Vincent's Hospital. So that was my childhood, a lawyer and a doctor. He was Jewish, she was Catholic. So
it's fascinating to me.
You know,
you're the second guy in a week I talked to who grew up in New York. I just talked to Ozza Jacobs.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
that's cool.
His parents were, you know, and still are, and were, you know, kind of like edgy experimental film makers.
Well, I always felt like real New Yorkers were the people who came to the city and chose it. You know, I always felt like I landed here kind of and didn't earn it somehow. But yeah, I've lived here all my life, and I still really love it.
You didn't earn it?
Yeah.
Came from where? Like the old country?
that was my grandparents.
Yeah.
But, you know, yeah, they did the work, you know, and yeah. I got the benefit.
But so you grew up like in all that culture. That must have been amazing because you had access. Whatever you may have been jealous of, you know, like it's like I was talking to Ozza about his parents and, you know, like, and how he, you know, they would go like look at these like weird film festivals at the Museum of Modern Art. The one thing that you got when you grow up in New York is you have access to all of that. I remember going to the Museum of Film and Broadcasting. Do you remember what we had to do to watch film clips, you know, when we were interested back in the day?
Oh, so much work. And if you wanted to see an old movie, like uncut and without commercials, you just had to like wait until it hit one of the revival theaters and then go.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and that was like what was fascinating about reading the pictures at a Revolution was that, you know, I had no idea about any of that, about how long they kept films in the movie houses, and they would wait like a year. They just let movies play like a year to see if it would make money.
Right. I read old issues of Variety and The Hollywood Reporter from that time, and the first time I saw this, I thought it was a joke, but they would say things like, you know, this week in the heat of the night, hit the 6th and 7th run circuit of movie theaters. And there are apparently like 9 circuits of theaters across the country, and movies would play sometimes for 2 years. Amazing.
And you learned all that when you were writing that?
Yeah, I did not know that before I wrote the book. Let
me ask you this. Why doesn't somebody make a movie about the making of Dr. Dolittle?
I would rather see a movie about that than another remake of Dr. Dolittle. I think it would be a lot more fun.
After I read your book, I don't even know why they would make a remake of a disaster. Like, it was categorically a disaster. I didn't know. I mean, I saw it when I was a kid. I thought it was all right. I can still probably remember 2 of the songs. But it was like, from everything you wrote, it was a disaster. And the making of it just seems fucking hilarious. I mean, like, how could you not make that movie to, you know, give it the treatment, like, what was that great satire that Ben Stiller did, the war movie?
Tropic Thunder.
Tropic Thunder. Like, treat it like that.
You know, when I was working on that book, the only time I had to stop my research was about Rex Harrison, because I thought, the stuff I'm finding out is so bad that I have to go hunt around for people who knew him to see if anybody has a good thing to say. And I tried, and I found a couple of people who said, well, when are you writing about? And I said 1967, and they said, no, he was a monster. Like, if you were writing about the 50s or the 40s, he was still a decent human being, but not by then.
Wow.
So
it's so funny because while I was reading it, I interviewed Jodie Foster, who has experience and memories with Stanley Kramer, and also, like, her mother worked for Jacobs for
wow, really? I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, her mother, like, you know, when he was still a publicist, her mother was in publicity. What was his name? Arthur Jacobs?
Arthur Jacobs, yeah.
He seemed like a character.
Oh, yeah. I mean, again, like, died long before I even imagined the book. But really one of those great kind of what makes Sammy run, you know, I'm going to hustle and pull this thing together, you know, just on Scotch tape and a prayer. And you know, ended up making this insane movie. Yeah, and he did a lot of stuff, a lot of those guys. Like, and I watched all the movies again, except for Dr. Dolittle, which I guess I should. And I've seen The Graduate so many times I didn't watch it again. But I wanted to watch, you know, I've watched Catch-22, Carnal Knowledge, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which I imagine you cover pretty thoroughly in the book. Definitely. Because you cover Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf pretty well, because in Pictures at the Revolution, because it happened before The Graduate. But you know, it seems to me that, like, the vision that Nichols had, you know, certainly for Catch-22, like, now, how did he, what do you think of that movie in terms of, did that get away from him, or was that exactly what he was trying to do? Well, Catch-22 was the first time that he really had absolute power. I mean, it was the first movie he made after the success of Virginia Woolf and The Graduate. So he had as much money as he wanted, which was more than the budget. He hired everyone in Hollywood to be in it. Right. And crazy huge cast from Alan Arkin and... wasn't Orson Welles in it? Orson Welles is in it. Gave him like 2 weeks of absolute misery on the set, according to everyone who worked with Orson Welles. And the shoot took forever. It was in Mexico. It was in Italy. It was in Los Angeles. And, you know, I think that Mike, in later years, kind of went back and forth between finding things to like in the movie and just feeling that he hadn't cracked it. I mean, it was hard for him to separate the experience of the final product from the incredibly long ordeal of making it. And then, sort of the worst thing that could possibly happened, which is he finally finishes it. They're 3 months from opening, and MASH opens. And, like, the moment Mike Nichols saw MASH, he thought, oh, my movie's dead. I mean, that this is the movie about another war, but really about Vietnam, that everyone is going to want to see. And this is the kind of loose, improvisatory, seat-of-your-pants style that I should have gone for, you know? Yeah, because, like, I don't know what his choice was. I mean, I imagine that the weight of, you know, how Fellini saw things must have been on him to some degree, because it was really a surrealistic, you know, disconnected film. I mean, there's a lot of great parts to it. And I know the novel's difficult, but there's no way that movie came together. No, and Fellini, you're absolutely right, was really on his mind. Right. I mean, you know, he thought 8.5 for a long time was the best movie ever made. And he wanted to go to Italy because, you know, he could do Fellini-esque sequences there. You know, he never, Buck Henry, who wrote the movie, later said that he thought the big mistake was that Catch-22 is all about attitudes, and Mike was all about behavior, and he couldn't find any human behavior to put in that movie. Kind of an interesting theory. Well, that's interesting, seeing that, you know, what we were talking about earlier was really the new thing he brought to theater was exactly that. Right. And somehow it got away from him in that movie, probably because he got lost in, you know, just the expanse and expense of it. Like, it's hard to find humanity when you can do whatever you want with major movie stars. Right, and when you're crashing planes and blowing up boxes of dynamite, and you know, like Mike was never a huge fan of filming outdoors or action sequences. Like, that was not his comfort zone, and the Catch-22 was the first time he really pushed himself there, and I don't think it was a happy experience for him particularly. It's a bizarre movie. And Carnal Knowledge, I don't think is talked about enough, because I watched that recently, and it's a great movie. I love it. I love it, too. I mean, I think if that movie came out right now, it would be in some ways as shocking as it was 50 years ago. Oh, just for that last scene. And that was also a very Mike thing. Like he said over and over again, if you do something big that's like a big public failure, which Catch-22 was, the best thing you can do is go right into something small that means something to you, that you don't have big commercial expectations for, that you just want to do because you love the people or love the material. And that's how he got to Carnal Knowledge.
Did it do well?
It did do well. I mean, it sort of turned out, it was a big commercial success and incredibly controversial. And
was it
really?
Because of the sex?
Yeah, there was even an obscenity trial that went to the Supreme Court, which actually had to sit down and watch Carnal Knowledge and rule that it was not obscene. So. It wasn't the quiet little movie that Mike thought he was going to make after Catch-22. It was a big, noisy little movie that he made.
Isn't that, those fights, it's interesting that those fights were taking place. What year was that? Like 71, 70?
It was 71, and it was right around the time that porn was going mainstream. And obviously Carnal Knowledge is not porn, but it was right in the thick of those fights of what can you show in a movie theater? What's okay to show?
So you're saying it's just shy of like Deep Throat showing in movie theaters.
Exactly. A couple of years later, I think actually by the time the Supreme Court resolved the Carnal Knowledge case, Deep Throat was open in theaters.
And arguably ruined culture forever. Yeah. Yeah. That's another question about, not about porn, but in reading the books and in talking to you, and your attention that you pay to critics of the past. And when I studied film, this idea that there were these feuds between Andrew Sarris and Pauline Kael, and that there was weight to them, and the passing of the guard of the old dude at the New York Times, and how that affected the run of a movie, the importance of criticism, both art criticism, cultural criticism. What did it obviously carried a lot of weight at another time.
It really did. I mean, there were, and people talk about critics as gatekeepers now, but now I don't really think there are gatekeepers like that. But back then, when there were so few critics, and when I remember growing up, my parents got Time magazine and Life magazine every week,
right?
And if those magazines gave a movie a good review, and if it got a good review in the New York Times, they would want to go see it. And if they didn't, if everything got bad reviews, that movie was off the list. There was almost nothing that would change their minds.
That's interesting. So that again speaks to the loss of monopoly and intimacy within the media landscape. That it was a time where you had 3 networks and public TV, and then you had a few large magazines. Really, most of the country was on the same pages, give or take, and the same information was coming in.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, the funny thing is, what they weren't on the same page about was movies didn't open in 3,000 or 4,000 theaters at once. They would have weird distribution patterns where one movie would open in Los Angeles and then sort of roll across the country and eventually get to New York. One would open, in New York and then Chicago and then Boston and then Los Angeles. So there wasn't this big, all at once, here's the movie moment. But on the other hand, movies stayed in theaters for so long that you really did get to have an ongoing conversation.
Well, yeah, and everybody wasn't connected. You had to write a letter to somebody to tell them to see a movie, or make you know what I mean, or make a long distance call. So the actual pace of life was extraordinarily slower, and you could, that makes sense. That's why you could run a movie for 2 years, because you could open it up in an area and no one else could see it, and the information they got about it would just be a long tease, and then you just sort of wait around until eventually maybe it got to your theater. There's no other options.
Right. And if you wanted to see the movie the way you were supposed to see it, you did have to see it in the theater, because it wasn't like there was cable. I mean, it would get on network TV eventually, but it would be chopped up for length and chopped up for content. So this was your chance. You had to go to the theater.
Well, in terms of are there, let's talk about it. I've read Andrew Sarris. I've read some Pauline Kael. I did a history of cinema class. And, I really think that you framed a lot of the stuff, not just around, Mike Nichols and the influence of the French New Wave or European movies coming into this country in the 60s and the influence they had in that book. I'm sure you talked about it in the Mike Nichols book, that, that there was the context you created in Pictures at the Revolution really, reframed my entire understanding of a lot about movies in general.
Wow.
And